You know it. We know it. The government knows it. Housing affordability in the UK is absolutely terrible right now and has been for a while. The cost of renting in the United Kingdom has increased by 7% in the past 12 months, and some areas are seeing even higher increases. Today, Londoners are paying on average around 40% of their wages on rent.
Now, the government is doing some things to try and change it. Angela Rayner's Renters' Rights Bill is a major first step in addressing the power imbalance between tenants and landlords. It will outlaw Section 21 no-fault evictions. It will end fixed-term tenancies to give renters more flexibility. It will increase eviction notice periods and improve conditions in the rented sector. But it does little to address the big issue in the cost of living crisis, affordability.
Across the UK, there has been a growing movement from campaigners and politicians calling for rent controls, an ability for governments or councils to control the rate at which the cost of rent increases. So, to find out how rent controls might work in practice, we're joined today by Abi O'Connor, an urban sociologist who researches the political economy of housing, land and regional inequality. Abi, welcome to Pod Save the UK. Thank you for joining us from the glamour of a hotel room in Sheffield.
Thank you so much for having me, and it is indeed very glamorous.
Abi, I just want to ask you, and explain it to me like I'm 5. What is rent control?
Or indeed explain it to someone who has a newborn child and so is sleeping between 2 and 4 hours a night.
I say explain it like I'm 5 because that is my comprehension levels right now. If you could do it in picture book form, that would be even better.
Okay, so put very simply, rent controls are literally limitations on how much profit landlords can extract from renters every single month. So it is a limitation on what rents can be charged by a landlord to their tenant every single month. And they come in different forms, and often that becomes quite a confusing aspect of rent controls. But really broadly, the most commonly advocated for rent control is one which stops landlords charging above a certain amount. So be that based on average income or average wage growth or average inflation rates. And then that percentage would be added onto a rent yearly, and that would stop landlords charging above that rent.
Talk to us a little bit about the figures that are involved behind our current housing crisis, Abi. Like, what's the current situation that is driving these kind of conversations? I know people listening to this podcast, especially I would say probably our listeners kind of under 40 or even in their 40s, will be living the kind of day-to-day reality of this. But how bad are things really right now?
I mean, they're the worst they've been. You mentioned in the start there around how much rents cost in certain cities. So since 2015 alone, which is, quite recent, private rents in London have increased by over 45%, and wages during that time have only increased by 21%, right? So that's under half. We're seeing in cities like Manchester, for example, and northern cities that historically are cheaper cities to live in. Manchester, on average, people are now paying 45% of their wages on rent. Of course, in London, it's over half. Before the 1980s, when we did have some form of rent controls, private tenants were paying 10% of their income on rent in this country. And some of them are now paying nearly 60%. So we know it's that chronic in terms of what's going out of people's pockets monthly. But there's other dimensions that we need to think about. We've got over 1.4 million people on the social housing waiting list, hundreds of thousands of children living in unsafe temporary accommodation. And I think the other really big figure that I'd like to discuss, which is a key aspect of why we advocate for rent controls with our campaign, the Homes for Us Alliance, is that over the next 5 years, the government are going to pay £70 billion directly to private landlords as a subsidy because people can't afford their rent. And that's through what's called local housing allowance. So that's the difference between what someone can afford in their wages to what their rent is being charged. And the government, as a benefit, top that up. Now, this is not a case to not support local housing allowance. People should have that support if they need it. But the question remains, should our government, when our public services are crumbling, when there are people in temporary accommodation, be paying £70 billion over the next 5 years directly into the pockets of private landlords because there's no controls on how much they can charge in rent? That's hugely problematic. And that's a figure that I don't think many people foresaw coming. That's how much rents have risen and how much wages haven't, and people are struggling.
God, that's a horrible number. And, when you think about that, if I was, I don't know if this is too strong to say, but it feels like a kind of public theft. Do you know what I mean? You take from the public and then you give it to private landlords. And then at the same time, you have this narrative playing out that if you claim any of these benefits, you're you're a skiver or work shy or you don't deserve it. I do want to just mention as well in terms of the London rent situation, because I feel when I chat to some of my mates in other cities that there's a sense that like London's an anomaly. And also there's a sense of, well, fuck London as well, which I get, I understand that desire, but I just, I think it's worth saying, as you have there, that like other cities are going through the same things. And actually whatever happens in London is going to roll out into every corner of the UK. Where I live at the moment, basically all the property prices have gone up, the rents have gone up, and I can see it happening, the impacts on the high street, because literally no one's got money for a coffee anymore. And what used to be quite a nice vibey bit, and just slowly but surely you can kind of see the wheels turning. It's choking everything in terms of the impact.
So in terms of affordability, rent control wouldn't actually immediately bring rents down, right? Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, so it wouldn't. What it could do is it could freeze rents, depending on the generation of rent controls that are chosen. And I'm speaking positively, they will be chosen. It could freeze them, or it would curb where they increase. Now, there are mechanisms that could be used and historically have been used elsewhere called rent rollbacks. For example, they were used in Berlin in recent years, but then reneged on there for multiple reasons. But firstly, I would say that as someone that works in and around research and policy, and, I'm speaking today on behalf of the Homes for Us Alliance, which is an alliance of national tenants unions and charities fighting for housing equality, we're honest about where we're at and we're honest about what we're asking for. For us to turn around and say that we're then coming for a reduction, which would hit landlords' pockets immediately, is not something that would be strategic or realistic. And I think I have responsibility to fight for something that will overnight change people's lives. And the people that I see day to day that are, losing their homes or can't afford their rent, or, are using food banks because of how much their rent is. Us asking for a rent freeze is probably the most palatable aspect that we could have now, and then working towards what that looks like in the future. Unfortunately, it's been that long that we're at the stage now where rents are already at an unmanageable level. So I'm not under any illusion that if we were to win rent controls tomorrow, that it would solve this crisis, but it would certainly stop it from getting any worse. And I guess to your other point, Nish, around it wouldn't reduce rents, it wouldn't, but the immediate impact would be increasing people's disposable income. If you're not paying 60% of your rent to your landlord, you can, dare I say it, spend your money in the local economy. And this government's big push is around growth, right? But we don't have any money to spend in the economy to improve growth because it's all going to, a few landlords. And I think the other thing, which is not material, but is really important, and it goes back to kind of the example you were giving, Coco, of people struggling in communities and not being able to go out and spend money. And you just think about how many people have been displaced, particularly in cities or seaside towns, because suddenly their area is the next space to be gentrified, and how many people have to leave the community that they've made their home. And often in these conversations, we don't talk about that.
Sometimes when we have a conversation about rent controls, there's a sense implied, certainly in the right-wing press, if you brought in rent controls, it would destroy house prices, and then everyone would find themselves in negative equity. And this is just you got to break some eggs, right? And so let's throw the renters under the bus. House prices, I'll use London as an example, have inflated so much because of buy-to-let mortgages. So it's people that have been buying properties expressly to rent them out, and that's pushed up prices. So would the inverse happen then if there was rent controls? Is that how it would work? Because renting pushed the prices up, so therefore if you controlled it, it would push the prices down.
The supply and demand argument just doesn't work for housing. Housing's a fixed asset. It's a long-term fixed asset, not a perishable good. So it's not a service that expires, and the house doesn't disappear. So if a landlord exits the market, which is the argument around if you push rents down, then landlords will rush out of it. And how will all these poor renters be able to rent a home? Well, that's not rent controls doing that. That's landlords choosing to exit a market because it's less profitable to them. And also those homes still exist, and there are many options that we can use to bring those homes into use. The same argument around supply and demand and the loss of homes or the loss of landlords or prices rising was levelled in a similar vein against the introduction of minimum wage in the 20th century. So when first discussions came about minimum wage, the opposition to it said it would cause mass unemployment. across the board. People would suddenly be unemployed because no employers are going to pay minimum wage, and it will cause a huge recession and it will ruin the economy. Now, 25 years later or so, we couldn't imagine life without minimum wage. You know, that's a cornerstone of our society. That's something that many people across the political spectrum have sought to increase. And the empirical evidence is unequivocal. It did not cause a massive crash. Just like the evidence around rent controls that's often used when people say it will raise rents or it will cause a massive housing crisis. If you actually do some digging around the actual empirical studies that are used, the research studies, is very flimsy. Just like the studies around increasing housing supply en masse, the argument around that is that it will reduce costs. That's only very marginal, and that's over a long time period. The way to reduce costs is to put curbs on how much people are able to profit from something. That is the way that you reduce that. We did it on energy. We have energy caps, and people weren't up in arms about that.
So we asked our listeners if they had thoughts on rent control. And this one is from Dan. So Dan said rent control was a no-brainer for the government. It costs them nothing, but also may actually save money due to the amount the government subsidises landlords via housing benefits, as you mentioned there. I guess I wanted to share that just because, you know, Dan said what we all think.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. But also just to sort of follow on from that, why do you think housing benefit is not one of the benefits that we talk about when we have this never-ending conversation about benefits in the UK? Have you noticed that? I've noticed that. It's constantly about disability benefits all the time and young people being depressed. You never hear about housing benefit. I just wondered if you had any wisdom to share on that.
I mean, I think it's two things. One is that one of the reasons why we focus on disability benefits is because it's very easy to punch down on disabled people. You know, just to be frank about that. And I would also say that I haven't mentioned in this a discussion of, you know, disabled renters, and they are some of the most hard hit by high costs. Some of them are having to live in larger apartments because they need that for equipment or carers. You know, that's very much ever present in the work we do on housing, and ensuring that it is into any policies we put forward are intersectional at their heart. But I also think more broadly, and thinking more sociologically about this, the ideological project to turn housing into this vehicle to gain profit has been so successful. I mean, when people ask me, what do you think is the most impactful policy that's been implemented in the UK history, I would say hands down the right to buy. It split working class communities in two, because it became the haves and the have-nots, those that could afford their council house and those that couldn't. So that totally divided the working class vote. And you still see that now when you talk about public housing, and it's stigmatized social housing. So I think the reason why people often don't want to talk about local housing allowance is because there's a lot of people out there that are benefiting from local housing allowance subsidizing that market. That's a reality. But I think if we started to acknowledge how much was going out in housing benefit, we'd have had to have this conversation that we're having today 15 years ago. And there is a reality to this, and this is not me defending it. There's a lot of small landlords, you know, let's think of, I don't know, Karen and Tim, an old couple that live in, let's say, Liverpool, because it's my favorite city and my home. They found themselves with a house that they bought under the right to buy. And then they had kids and wanted to move to a bigger house. So, but they didn't sell it because they were told, oh, keep it. You know, you've got low wages, you're a working class family, you know, keep the house, rent it out, or let someone live in it. And they've become what are considered to be the accidental small landlords. This is not me defending that as a sector at all. It's just me painting the picture. And then suddenly, as jobs became casualised, as industries continued to fall, you know, that old couple, whose artificial names I've already forgotten, they're reliant on that house for their pension that they didn't have, for the private healthcare because the NHS is on its knees. So who wouldn't want to be able to afford to be able to have the life-changing surgery that you need, and to be able to afford that on the private healthcare because the other public services are crumbling? So I think, you know, the way we think about housing generally in this country is so for want of a better word, unhinged.
Another listener, Amy, was sceptical about rent controls. She said, I love the idea of it in theory, but I worry that if landlords are told that there's a maximum they can charge on rent, that they will adjust the rent to the maximum right from the go, with no incentive to fix property issues or improve the standard of living for the tenants. A similar thing happened with university tuition fees and the energy bill cap. Do you think that that is a risk, Abby?
I think that is certainly a risk, and it's a risk, though, that can and should be mitigated for. I do a lot of work with tenants unions and community organisations, and we do a lot of casework around disrepair. I completely, wholeheartedly understand and have experienced that fear that conditions will get worse. I completely empathise with that. I've seen it. I've been on the front line and done the work on it. However, conditions are really bad right now anyway. MedAct, the wonderful health workers organisation that do work on housing as well, showed that, over half of the health workers that they spoke to said that they send patients home knowing their home will make them more sick the minute they get home. Because we know that there's over 1 million people living with black mold, and landlords are still not forced to fix that. So rent controls on their own is not enough. Yeah. And I think in terms of the fear of they will lift it to the highest height, yes, that's a fear, but that's one that can be ironed out in policy in terms of, I would like to be looking through. Again, this is not a completely radical idea. If a landlord chooses to raise it by X amount one year, then how long do the freezes last for the next few years? There are things that you can build in there. In an ideal world, we'd be saying rents are astronomical. They cannot go up until wages have hit the level that rent has increased over the last 15 years. I mean, in reality, that's what I would like to be putting forward. Again, is that palatable for a government? Probably not.
I completely understand that fear of landlord retaliation. I would say I grew up in social housing, and I have a story that sounds really old, but isn't, because I'm in my 30s, so I'm not actually that old. And I kid you not, this actually happened. My older sister got tuberculosis. No, it was not the Victorian age. It was the 90s in East London. Anyway, she got tuberculosis. We didn't have central heating in our council house. Again, it's the 90s, not Victorian England. And my GP wrote a letter to the council and was like, you can't have a young woman with tuberculosis in a house without heating. So they put the heating in. Anyway, it was like a success story. And it made me think, I wish I could say to all the private renters of the world, social housing, obviously not now because it's in a terrible state, and you just need to follow Kwejo Twenoboa. Please do follow him on social media, who takes a lot of local authorities and social housing providers to task on what they've done. But there has been a time, I have lived it as a millennial, where housing providers had to secure the life of the people that live in it. So I just thought I would just share that. And in the spirit of that, I suppose my final question is, what can we do to make it happen now in 2025?
From a fundamental point of view, is I'd like to think that the majority of people want everyone to live in safe and secure homes. So it should be an issue for everyone. But also the point of the extraction of public money into the private sector affects homeowners. Maybe your local authorities would have more money to fill in potholes if they weren't subsidising landlords. So I would say we need to work together, as a coherent voice. The landlord lobby do it and have done it very successfully. So my plea is to people to do that with your neighbours, with your friends. Speak to your mayors if you have them, your metro mayors or leaders of councils. Speak to your MPs. Tell them your stories. They're what's most powerful. I can sit here and reel off stats till the cows come home, but actually it's the real stories, like the one you just shared, Coco. The woman I spoke to the other day who waited 18 years for a new front door from her private landlord, and there was a hole in it.
Oh my God.
Right? They're the stories that matter. And I would say, if you are a renter, join your local renters union, tenants unions. They're all over the country. And then I would say the other thing is, and I will give a plug to it because this is the topic of this week, is we have a Homes for Us Alliance, which is an alliance of like-minded folk, charities, tenants unions, organisations nationally that we support, that are coming together to launch a campaign on rent controls, and request that Metro mayors, Andy Burnham, Sadiq Khan, Oliver Coppard, people that have talked about rent controls before and have been in support of it. Sadiq Khan first mentioned them years ago. Again, they're not the folk devil that they're made out to be. So we're campaigning to get them to call for national government to give them the powers to implement rent controls locally. Please Google Homes for Us Alliance, get in touch with us and join us, is what I would say.
So what you're saying is I should email Sadiq Khan and tell him about my childhood.
Absolutely, yes.
Dear Mayor Khan.
I fully encourage that.
I just like the idea of just treating Sadiq Khan like he's my uncle and just like reaching out to him, telling him anecdotes from my past.
I'm sorry to say that I have done that once whilst drunk at a party that the mayor was present at. I did try to ask him to sort out one of my friend's bins.
I mean, I fully support that.
And what happened? Please, what happened?
I don't know. I
can't remember. You're so drunk.
I don't think Anushka Shankar still has a problem with her bins, from what I know. I'll ask her, but from what I understand, her bins did get sorted out. I just can't believe that that's the best lobbying route available to us. I hope that I am drunk in a room with the Mayor of London again.
Well, I mean, look, if you're allowed to be in a room drunk with them, then that's, I'm all power to you. I'm not.
In retrospect, that feels like a security oversight. I actually don't fully know how that happened either.
But if you're in a room drunk with them again, by all means.
Yes, straight to rent control, straight to rent controls.
Yeah, exactly.
Abi, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
Thank you.